Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Welcome to our Amphitheater Hot Shop. This is our Bring the Heat demonstration, and welcome to everybody that's joining us online as well. I would like to introduce our team. We have a visiting artist with us today. This is Richard Whiteley. He's one of our full-time workers here at the museum. He's actually our senior programs manager over at the studio. Now, Richard works primarily with cast glass, and we can talk quite a bit about that. And I think he's got some lovely images that we'll show you throughout the demonstration. But today he's going to be experimenting with our team here, George Kennard, Jeff Mack, my name is Chris Rochelle, and making some blown forms into molds. So you can see a couple of the really big molds with plaster that he's put together. But Richard started as an apprentice at a stained glass studio at the age of 17, went on to get his undergrad degree at Australian National University, the School of Art and Design, and then later on an MFA at the University of Illinois. And he has actually a really nice piece in our collection too. So if you leave our demonstration and go up through the Contemporary Art and Design Gallery, you can see one of Richard's pieces. It's in the back corner over there. But I'll let Richard talk quite a bit about his work. I'll jump in and narrate through the process as well. But thanks for joining us.
There we go. You can hear me now? Great. Well, thank you everyone for the warm welcome, and it's great to be a part of the team here. I'm usually working cast glass, which is a really slow process, and I usually spend a lot of time working by myself during that process. So the invitation to come here and work with the team in hot glass is a really exciting opportunity for me. I know hot glass, I've worked around it, but it's not something I specialise in. So I mainly work in cast glass, which requires building a mould and then casting glass into it. That's very similar to bronze casting. And it's like bronze casting on Valium, because it just takes so long to work with glass. The opportunity to try and bring my skills into the hot shop, I thought about using a really ancient technique called mold blowing, which is a technique that the Romans were using 2,000 years ago. Now, they were making, small objects. You can see some of those in the 35 Centuries Gallery. And those objects are really interesting because 2,000 years ago, glass blowing was quite a new technology. And the Romans really developed a series of techniques that were quite influential and still used by artisans today. I've taken that idea and scaled it up quite a bit. So this is just a pure plaster mould. And what I've done with that is, I'll talk about what the shape is in a little minute, but I just thought it'd be good to give you a bit of background on the process. So this is just pure plaster. And what the glass blowers will do will make a traditional bubble, and they'll gather up a whole bunch of glass on that, and then we'll blow into it, and the glass will take the shape of the form, and it happens quite quickly. It'll happen in about 30 minutes or so of gathering, and the blowing process into the mould will only take a few seconds. So that's very different to the type of process that I usually use. I've got some images. Whoops. So this is the kind of cast glass that I make. And this is a block of rectilinear glass. And I'm really interested in the properties of glass, the transparency, and how light comes through the material. So here, the void, the actual hole that's in the glass, is the compositional element for the work. So I start with that a form that will actually become a hole in the glass, and I'm interested in how the light moves through that form and creates this composition. So that lip on the front of the piece there is something that's hand carved into the work, and I do that afterwards. So I cast the glass, let it cool down to room temperature, and then there's a laborious technique of cold working to bring that surface. So this piece is called Subvert, and it was made about 11 years ago, and what I was thinking about here is how the light is getting pushed under, the light is getting subverted through the form, and I was trying to give the effect that the the light was affecting the form, transforming the glass. So this is another piece, a more recent work called Arc. And this piece is flat on the front, so I'm using the optical effects of how light moves through the material. My apprenticeship in stained glass was very influential. Light through glass is something that's really mesmerizing. Anyone who's been to any church with stained glass windows, you can see that effect and just how rich and luscious that technique is. So working in a cast glass process, that piece is all one colour glass. It's a very light blue, but you can see that halo around the piece. That's actually the thickest part of the glass. And the reason that's highlighted like that, as I go to the next image, you can see that thick area protruding through the back. The front area is quite flat. And that thick area at the back there is polished, so it lets the light through and it creates that halo effect. So I'm interested in the optics of how the light moves through the material. Glass is a very unique medium for that. Light passing through a material is something quite unusual for artists to work with. This is the piece that's in the museum. This was made in 2008 for an exhibition that I had in Sydney, Australia, which is where I'm from. And this is human height, about 180 centimetres. That's 70 inches in American language. And here, again, what I'm using is the voids, the hollows within the work, to create an interesting structure and then building this kind of architectural form around the outside. And those transition points where the holes punctuate that front surface, that is, that's all carved as if it's like this organic transition. So that's just, as Chris was saying, at the back of the contemporary wing. So that's a little bit about my work. I wanted to take you into my process and just show you a little bit about my thinking. So here on the, your left-hand side, there's a bunch of models. So I often work very quickly with clay or plasticine just to kind of think through some ideas about shape and composition. Quite often I'm modelling what will be a void, and then I start to scaffold what a shape would be around it. So I use a lot of cardboard, as you can see there, just using pieces of cylinders and other shapes, cardboard cartons that we have in the house, just as quick ways to think through ideas. Then I take those ideas into the studio. This is a refractory material. It's a plaster silica material that I've pre-poured, and then I'm carving it like a stone. And this will actually be a hole within the glass. If I jump to the next slide, you can see that form, that carved form. It's a slightly different form, but I've bolted that into a casting mould. So there's several weeks of work to get just to this point, and then the glass gets loaded into it. This is back in Australia. I moved here in 2019 to join the museum team, just before the pandemic. So there's 300 pounds of glass in each of these moulds, and this is where the real time happens. The glass gets loaded in. I have to go in a little fire suit to load extra glass in. And this is at top temperature, which is about 1500 degrees centigrade. So it's quite hot, and it only sits there for about 24 hours, but then it takes 6 weeks to cool down to room temperature. Glass has to go through this process called annealing, which is basically, it just means controlled cooling. And for these forms, as glass gets thicker, the cooling time for the glass gets exponentially longer. So something that's a wine glass can cool down from being formed in 30 minutes. Something that's twice as thick will take 4 times as long, and then suddenly it multiplies out. So these pieces are about 6 weeks, and if you think that's tough, In the Innovation Centre, there's a huge telescope mirror, a blank, and it's got all these big cracks in it. It was made here in Corning in 1932, I think. They annealed it for a year, and it cracked. They had to start again. And that was, I think that was for Mount Palomar telescope. I'm getting nods from the people who've been here longer than me. Anyway, it's an amazing testament to people like me who often opens up a kiln after many weeks of work and goes, oh, if only I had annealed it longer. So as the pieces come out of the kiln, they are blanks. And that's when, for me, the real work starts. I start carving like a stone carver. So there's the additive process of making a form and casting the glass, and then a subtractive process of carving it. And that's something that I can't always anticipate because I'm modelling things in a non-transparent material, and once it's cast into a transparent material, the optics and the light behaves differently. And those subtleties are very important. So I spend that time shaping and carving, literally using like a body grinder and a diamond blade to hack out different shapes, and then I go through a refined period of cooling. So I like the presence of large forms. This is a piece that I finished in 2018, 19. I think we made this. This was a piece that was in an exhibition at the Shanghai Museum of Glass in 2019. And this is the scale that I really like to work, but of course there's many months of work in that, and what I'm trying to do here today with this team is work in a more immediate process. So there's a couple more works of mine, Body Void, 2016. You can see a more organic and asymmetry that's starting to happen within the work. And then this one from 2016 again as well. And a lot of these, you know, I'm trying to give this asymmetrical feel to the work, and I'm trying to demonstrate that the voided form is affecting the outside of the piece. And with glass, because of that transparency, you can see the outside and the inside together. It's very easy for the works to get complicated. So for this project, what we're doing today, I literally started with little pieces of cardboard, like little paper rolls and toilet rolls, and I was just experimenting with the symmetry of a cylinder or a vessel form, and thinking about how I can interrupt it. So as I explained earlier, I do a lot of model making. So I was just crushing these, and I was just looking at the aesthetic possibilities of little cylinders that were crushed in my hand. And I found that I did about 10 or 15 of them, and they were getting a little bit too, I was trying too hard to get an aesthetic property. So I shut my eyes, I do this a lot, to try and suspend that judgment, and just started crushing them with my eyes shut. And then we scaled them up, and we went to these forms over here, and I was rolling them out of construction cardboard, and then shutting my eyes and just hugging them and crushing them, and then thinking about were they interesting? And I found one that was, and that's this very large mold here. So once I found one that I was happy with, then I rigidized it. You can see on the left-hand side, layers of shellac on there. And then we've gone through and made a very simple mold, which is a plaster mold. And we've built up layers of that to get the thickness. And the amazing team here are going to blow glass into that form. We did a test the other day. This is one of the tests. And I'm really happy with it. This is for me a pretty big piece in the blowing process. The team here did it quite effortlessly, and what we're able to do is just blow into this form here and pick up that crinkled, crushed aesthetic that I was so interested in achieving. And then I've taken that and scaled it up to this form over here. So we're going to try this one first, and then if that works out well, we'll bring in the big one. And it'll take a little while, maybe 20 minutes or so, to build up the glass, and then we'll blow into that, and then we'll take another 30 minutes or so to set the next one up. So there'll be a lot of gaps in between, but it won't be as slow as my regular casting process. Otherwise, you'd be sitting here for weeks. Okay. Sure. Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah, thanks.
All right, let's give Richard a nice round of applause. Beautiful presentation, excellent introduction. Okay, so George has actually begun the process here. He's got a little bit of, is that gray, George? The same gray? He's melted a little chunk of raw glass color on the end of our blowpipe, and he'll start to build up those layers of clear glass. So most of this piece that you're looking at right here that Richard was just talking about, most of this is actually a transparent clear glass. We start off with a tiny little piece of color, which is pretty concentrated, and that little piece of color is on the inside of all these gathers of clear that George will build up. Then when we blow a bubble into that, that little bit of gray will expand into the clear, and ultimately the whole thing looks like it's tinted gray. But the color is pretty condensed. So I'll show you what he started with. He chopped a little piece of this gray color up earlier this morning, and he preheated it. So he took that little piece of color and he melted it onto the end of that stainless steel tube, that blowpipe. Now there's a couple hundred different colors that we can choose from. So this is called color bar or color rod, and this you can see is a kind of a nice cherry red. But this is really, really dense. So if we break about an inch of this bar off, melt it to the end of the blowpipe, and then get layers of clear glass, you can blow this up. And this would actually be a really faint kind of red. You can use bigger chunks or smaller chunks, depends on the density that you're after. But there's a little bit of planning that goes into it to say how dense do you want the final object to be in terms of scale and how far you're going to stretch it. But this is the newest way that we're going to be blowing glass. If you're watching George right now, he's capped this tube onto the end of the blowpipe. We're using compressed air because we're wearing masks. Now normally what we would do is put our mouth on the mouthpiece of the blowpipe and simply blow through. That is how glass blowing has been done for 2,000 years. But wearing a mask poses some restrictions to that, so we're using compressed air. You all probably can't see it from the seats, but there's a foot pedal in front of him. When he wants air pressure, he just taps that foot pedal. Now there's a regulator on that system, and right now it's at about 2 psi or less, which if you're not familiar with pounds of pressure, that's really, really soft, and it simply doesn't take much. Glass is extremely soft when it's this hot. But you're going to see George build this gather, or these multiple gathers up. So when we dip into our furnace, that's where we have our molten glass. It's held inside of a big ceramic crucible. It's at 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, Richard was talking about 1,500 Celsius. That's close to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is incredibly hot. Oh, you had already translated. Okay, I'm sorry. So I was going to say that was really, really hot. So the temperature in our furnace, though, over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the glass inside is really runny. It's got the same kind of consistency as table honey. That's what allows us to gather it out, but it's also what limits us to how much we can gather or collect at one time. So in between these multiple layers or gathers, George lets that core kind of stiffen up. So we call that cooling the glass, and that's relative. It just means rigid. But then he'll plunge back in. And how many gathers did you do on that first one? 5 gathers? 4 gathers? But each time we gather on a core, we have a larger and larger surface area to gather on. We can begin to get exponentially more glass each go around. So that is the second gather on that little bubble that he formed, or that little core of glass color. So the next gather, you're going to see this really start to build more and more material. And they've set up the larger mold. So the first piece that George went through with Richard was this smaller mold. That's the first one we're going to create today, and you can see the example or the sample piece over on the bench there. But this one has about 3 or 4 times the volume. So I imagine George will put an extra couple gathers on top of that one when we get to it. But you'll see him jump up on our steps here onto this big steel table called a marver, just so he can get in vertical position to really get all that glass inside the mold. Each of these molds is coated with a graphite spray as well. So the plaster would actually kind of stick to the molten glass when we go in and inflate into the mold. You could break it free from the mold, but you'll end up with these little bits of plaster on the glass object itself. So the graphite spray that Richard has coated the interior of these with is basically a resist. or a release, so it will stop any plaster residue from coming on there. Can we roll that gathering animation while we're in the process of building this up? So this is a really cool thing. If you check out the screens right now, this is a cutaway image of the inside of that melting furnace. That's a ceramic crucible that holds our glass. Oh, looks like it's frozen. We don't pause it that long when we go in there. But in this particular furnace, there's a big clay pot. This one can hold 1,000 pounds of glass if it's completely full. But yeah, so we open the door, we plunge downward into that ceramic crucible, and we start to make rotations in one direction, and then we kind of come level with it. This is Amanda. Amanda Kranz is handling all the online activity as well, so if there's anybody out there that's watching right now on Facebook or YouTube, and you have any questions, you can ask those questions. Amanda will field those to us, or Richard. So if you have any questions, we can address those through the process here. Do keep in mind that the team that's helping Richard create these pieces has a lot of experience. George himself has been blowing glass for around 30 years. Jeff's been blowing glass for close to that as well. It takes a lot of skill to be able to handle this much material as well. And of course, all the glass, it doesn't matter if it's clear, if it's gray, if it's blue, pink, brown, it all looks bright orange when it's 2,000 degrees. You'll see that orange kind of come and go through the process. The glass itself, what we're working with is called soda lime. It's a pretty common type. The main ingredient is silica sand. Soda ash and limestone are the other two main parts, but silica sand is the base ingredient for any glass out there. And the different colors are formed by melting in different metal oxides or metallic chlorides. The bar that I showed you, we purchased the bar as pre-made from a company over in Germany. There's some pretty big color companies that produce color like that. We buy from the Reichenbach factory. They've been making colors for about 200 years. That's their specialty. But when George takes these big gathers, the first thing he does is sits at this bench and he uses a big wooden scoop called a block. And this just organizes all that fresh glass, shapes and centers. These are cherry wood scoops, and it's very important that they have been soaked in water, just tap water. What he's picking up here is one of George's favorite tools. This is actually folded up wet newspaper. It's about as close as we can get to shaping with our bare hands. There's many, many layers of paper, so it's pretty well insulated. George is actually wearing a long sleeve shirt, which helps shield his arms from the radiant heat. Well, we're giving him a little extra protection with this paddle. We just call that shielding. Now, everything that we make needs to be removed from the blowpipe at some point. We establish a constriction line early on in the process for that. He's squeezing these tools called jacks over the bubble, and he's carving down this really clean constriction. We call that the jack line, named after the tool that he was just using, the jacks. But that's a really important step. We can make the most beautiful form successfully blown into a mold, but if you don't have a good line to break the bubble free, then you'll destroy the piece in the process. And Richard is using that compressed air gun just to blow the smoke away from George's face as he shapes with the paper tool. Jeff's taken over turning the blowpipe. A lot of teamwork in glass making, especially when you start to get larger scale. So this isn't enough material to fill the mold comfortably. Actually, it's plenty of material. You can blow that really, really large, but if you blow it too thin, then you can't really control the form. So what George is going to do is what we call a post-gather. He's setting this bubble up, leaving it relatively thick at the moment. Squeezing that constriction line is much easier with less glass, but once he has that set up, he's going to dip pretty much the entire bubble. He won't dip all the way up to that constriction, but he'll plunge most of that bubble back in the furnace, gather one, maybe two more times, and get the amount of material. But we have that constriction established early on, so when we blow this into the mold, that line is there, and we can break the piece free with no trouble. You can see that earlier on we set this mold up with a couple ratchet straps. So once you go into this mold, blowing into it, it would push the mold apart, so the ratchet straps will help keep everything together. And then once it's all inflated and we're ready, we'll just pop those straps right off and peel the mold apart. As Richard mentioned, there is a lot of waiting in between some of these steps. You have to make sure that this foundation, before you dip it in the furnace, is rigid. Again, we call that cold glass, where we say we're cooling it. This type of glass becomes totally rigid once it hits about 1100 Fahrenheit, so we'll just say 1000 degrees, nice round number. At 1000, our glass is cold, rigid. He was also talking about the slow cooling cycle that's necessary to keep glass intact from breaking. We call that annealing, and if you look on the sides of our stage, these black boxes are our annealers. So once this piece comes off the pipe, it'll get carried into one of those annealers where it will slowly cool. Now, as he also mentioned, thicker glass needs much, much longer to slowly cool or anneal. Thinner glass doesn't. This will be a blown form. It'll be pretty thick in certain areas, but I would guess that 24 hours should be plenty of time. You can see that orange really dissipating quite a bit, and that gray color starting to show through. Again, this is the same gray that's in that sample piece that's up there. Now, Richard, you're going to cut the top of this off level, right? So a lot of this glass up here, you can actually see the break-off line. So that's the constriction that we have established. When it breaks free, the glass is really jagged and sharp. But Richard's going to cut off wherever he picks out. He can use a diamond saw to cut the top of this off and remove that excess. So in the process of forming glass, there is some scrap material that's produced, and that just generally gets tossed. You can remelt the scrap glass, no problem, but with all the color that's been mixed in, we won't repurpose this, or we won't use it for what we have here. That furnace is full of clear glass, and we don't want to put any color in there. It would contaminate it. Ready? George is using a pipe cooler. You'll see him use that, especially when we start to build more and more layers here. Once you get a lot of glass, that pipe will heat up quite a bit. There's stainless steel, which is not a good conductor of heat, and that's how we can hold on to usually half of the pipe. But when you dip into the furnace and get this much glass, it does get pretty toasty. So we can use that water trough and cool the pipe off as we need to. You can see us squirting water on that newspaper pad. That is really, really important. If the paper or the wood is too dry and you're shaping glass at this temperature, lots of scum and residue just burns right into the surface of the material. The water actually turns to steam, and that's really the resist that stops the tools from sticking to the glass. Now we have a reheating furnace, which is a secondary oven. This one is empty. And one of the neatest things about our program here is this view that you're getting right now. We have a camera safely mounted behind this oven, which is running at 2000 degrees. A little window of fused silica is mounted in the back. That's a really special, very high temperature melting glass that the camera looks through. It's a product that was engineered here in Corning in 1934 by an organic chemist. And later on, NASA used it for their space shuttle windshields. Right here, we're using it for this really neat view into our reheating chamber. But really, the heat in the glass is what keeps it soft, what keeps it shapeable. And these furnaces are fueled with natural gas. There's forced air mixed in as well. They have reattached that blow hose, so George is inflating this a little bit. He can use that newspaper pad not only to shape, but also to stop the bubble from blowing out in certain areas. So he said he's going to go for it. All right. So this is one of those one-shot deals for glass making. And just press down on it as soon as he gets in there. So Richard and I are going to kind of hold the mold down as George inflates into this. It could actually start to kind of rise the mold up off this ceramic plate that we're on. We don't want that to happen. So once he gets in here, we'll press down on the mold, keep it in place. See how quickly it stretches out. Yep. Ready? Oh, bottom one first. That one's out of the way. Top one. Whew. What do you guys think? That deserves a big round of applause. Beautiful job, George. There's a large bubble to gather around. Yep. It's pretty flat right now. So we'll make some minor adjustments. The very bottom of this form, I'm just going to press it in a little bit with a wooden board. I gotcha. So before we put this away, broom, yep. What George is doing with that torch is keeping the thinner areas warm. We're going to allow the thicker areas in the bottom to kind of cool a bit so they all stiffen up, but we need to balance the temperatures out. And you can really see where that glass is thin. There's absolutely no orange color there. So George will take multiple quick reheats, we call a flash or a flash heat. Use the torch on the thinner areas, but ultimately just balancing the temperatures out, making sure that everything is rigid and right where we need it to be. And Jeff is already suited up to get this piece into the annealing oven. So there's a little bit of residue. That ceramic plate that we set the mold onto, it's called a kiln shelf, and we put some kiln wash on there, which is another form of resist. And sometimes the hot glass will pick up that kiln wash, and you can brush it off there before the glass is heated too much. And it looks like it's pretty clean. Jeff's wearing a big silver jacket that will reflect the heat from him. Some big Kevlar gloves and a face shield. You want to go in the bottom annealer or the top one? Which one's easier for you? The bottom? Okay. We have 2 annealers going, ready for this project. But the annealing temperature starts at 900 degrees for this particular glass. And then there's programs already established in the computer controllers on each of those annealers, so we can set whatever program Richard wants. But I'm imagining 24 hours should be plenty for this. This actually isn't really thick. You got that? You gonna flash again? All right. To help break this free, do you want any jacks or anything on that? Okay. George will put a little bit of water onto that constriction. That creates some thermal shock. And once that is thoroughly weakened from that, those tiny cracks form when water hits that constriction. He'll give a pretty good swift tap on that blowpipe with a wooden board, and that'll send the vibration through. It should do the rest. Just like so. Now we'll wait to give a round of applause until Jeff comfortably gets this into the annealer. This is where you really want all that protective gear on because he's climbing into a 900-degree oven. Safe and sound it goes. That's a big round of applause for the team. Richard Whiteley, George Kennard, and Jeff Mack. Beautiful. All right. Easy one's out of the way, right? Now we've got one that's about 3 times the volume. We'll go through the same kind of process, though, to set this up. I think that they're probably going to use that gray glass again, but George will probably gather about twice as much material for this. Question? Yeah. Do we ever blow into the blowpipes while we're in the reheating furnace? There are times that we have done that. Right now, obviously, there's some limitations wearing the mask, but you can inflate when you're in the oven. There's certain times you might want to do that. You have to be kind of careful, though. As the glass is getting heated in that furnace, the longer in there, the softer it gets. So it's kind of hard to gauge how much pressure to use when you're blowing through that. You can easily overinflate glass. You can blow it far too thin to control, so you do have to be careful with that. Anybody in the audience have any questions for us or Richard about anything? No? Okay. If you think of anything and you're curious, just shoot your hand right up and we'll answer it as we work. But looks like we'll start up the next one here. I'm guessing, are we using the same gray color as well? Yeah, very cool. Now, just like we have to slowly cool the glass, we have to slowly heat glass as well if we want to work with it. So that color rod that I showed you earlier on, when George prepared these pieces of gray, he put them into an oven on the far side of our stage. You can see Jeff and George over there looking into it right now. That's called a garage, and that garage can be used for a lot of different purposes, but right now they've just preheated those pieces of color to about 1,000 degrees. So from 1,000 degrees, you can take that color and put it right into that 2,000 degree oven and it's fine. But if you took a piece of color from room temperature and put it into a 2,000 degree oven, what do you suppose happens to it? Boom, it blows up almost instantly. So you gotta be really, really gentle with it. Do you need a hand with those, Richard? Get the straps on? Yep, of course. This way, yep. So we'll set up the same process to get this larger mold good to go with those ratchet straps. Give you a little slack. Is that good? All right. Good? Now we're not going to cinch this too tight. Don't want to crumble the plaster at all. Just firm enough to make sure they're in place. Want a little bit tighter than that? Yep. Okay. Gotcha. This way. Yep. You got it. Oh, we're a little twisted here. Hold on. There you go. Okay. How's that feel? Good? All right. Right before we go in. Sure. Very good. You can see all the peach coloring on here. That's the kiln wash. So George prepared this big kiln shelf, this ceramic plate earlier this morning. If you just had ceramic with no wash on there, and you took that giant hot bubble of glass and pressed into it, the glass could actually stick to the shelf. So we do need to put that on there. But that's why we were brushing that stuff off the last one. You'll see us do the same thing for this next one. Well, we have multiple furnaces up here. There's 2 reheating chambers for really big projects. We have a very large reheating oven that you can see on this side. So this one has not only 3 sets of barn-style doors, but sliders as well. So if we're making something incredibly large, we can use this, which has 4 burners firing into it, whereas these other ovens have 2 burners. But as you might imagine, this takes a lot of energy to get hot and use. So unless we really need it, we don't use it. But it's good to have. We have definitely used it many times in the past for big projects.
Hey, Chris, we've got a question.
Sure.
So one of the questions that's come in online is, what are the molds made of, and are they able to be reused again?
So these particular molds?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to address
Sure.
them?
So these particular molds are just made with plaster of Paris, and that's the only main ingredient. This one's got a little bit of wood that we've put in there as reinforcement, and then we've built the extra plaster around that, and that's just so it doesn't crack, because the plaster is reasonably brittle. There's a lot of pressure under there. In the foundry process that I use, plaster is not good at sustaining heat, so I need to cut it with something. It's a great modelling material, but if you heat it up in a kiln, if this whole mould got hot, it would just crack and fall apart. It would recalcine. So we add silica flour to that, very finely ground silica, which is basically glass, and we cut that sort of 50-50 with the plaster silica, and that allows the plaster to go up to temperature to that 1500 degree mark and hold its shape. There's some other things that get added in there, some little modifiers, sometimes some fiberglass strands or some other reinforcing, but essentially that's plaster silica that goes in the kiln, and then these blow molds are generally made out of plaster. You can make them out of metal, and we were talking earlier about what the Romans were using. We think that they were using like a terracotta type mold. So there's a number of materials, but the heat is 1100 or so degrees, but it's only on the surface for a short period of time.
So you've used that smaller one twice now?
Yeah, that's the 3rd time we've blown into that.
That's the 3rd time you've blown into that smaller one.
With my casting process, I'll only get 1 shot out of it, and then I can recycle those materials. But with these, we can get 4 or 5 goes out of the plaster. If we made this out of metal or a more durable material, it would last infinitely.
Yeah, infinite. Have you used anything else other than graphite spray as a resist?
I haven't done a lot of this process, so I had to kind of learn about it as we were preparing for the demonstration today. Graphite is what all of the team has recommended, and it's worked really well.
Yeah, it seemed nice and clean.
And it just provides that little bit of a barrier to stop the glass from sticking to the plaster.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's other materials. And I put that on with an alcohol, and that soaks into the surface of the mold. Yeah.
Nice. And then you actually buffed that too to get a nice sheen to the graphite.
Yeah, a nice sheen. So we can actually see that if we open up this mold as we finished using it. You can see here, I don't know if we can get a camera on that. There we are. I'm all good. Yeah. So this surface here, it looks like it's metal, but it's actually just plaster with the graphite on it. You can see that little spot there where the coating has started to flake off. That's actually the plaster recalcining. It can't handle the heat, so it's starting to flake off there. But I can go back and buff that and redo it again.
Put some more graphite on there.
So I think the most we can get out of one of these would be maybe 10 before the whole mold would start to crumble.
Right, break apart.
But it's certainly enough to experiment with and see what's possible. And if this works out, if the outcomes are exciting, then I can make some more durable molds if we want to put this into production.
Sure.
It's a way of quickly prototyping ideas.
As Richard was talking earlier about the amount of process and time that goes into some of his castings, to create those molds and making the voids and sculpting those parts, which I think in itself is really fantastic as well. The sculpting process of just, carving out a mold that is going to be used for a different material entirely. But he was also talking a bit about glass and how it uses light, and you can use the different thicknesses and the different colors to play with light with the material, and it is truly unique in that way. And it's one of the most amazing things I think about this material, and playing with those different thicknesses and colors. And this is really a very small amount of color, but intentionally so that you can really see the light factor with these pieces. G. Brian was down here earlier, we were looking at this piece that was made. We were saying that when you cut the top of this off, there's a lot of density of color up here, but when you cut the top of that off, this is going to look so much lighter when you get rid of that, because that dark gray is kind of absorbing much of that light, not allowing it to shoot downward through this. But once you remove that, it'll look like an entirely different piece. But glass blowers learn the densities of the colors. I was talking a bit about the company that we purchase from. There are many different companies you can buy color from. We buy from the Reichenbach factory, and each color has its own density, so you have to play around with that. You have to experiment with it a little bit. If you get a brand new color you've never used before, what I like to do, I know a lot of people do the same thing, is just make a little ornament or a little sample bowl, something really small that you can produce in a couple minutes just to take a look at the color. And then you can say, okay, that's a pretty light color, it washes out very easily, so I need to use a lot more, or it's very, very dense. Some colors are extremely dense, and it's actually hard to get them to wash out, but it all depends. This gray is kind of a medium one, but it's a really pretty, it's called neutral gray. So George is going through the process of building up these gathers yet again. He's using that compressed air gun just to speed things along. We have 2 lines of compressed air going to the bench. The inflation tube that we use, again, that is set to, I think, about 2 psi or under. We can adjust it very easily, but it doesn't take much when you're blowing glass. When it's as hot as we work it, it's extremely soft, so we just use gentle pressure. But that higher pressured air gun is used just to cool or stiffen the glass quickly from the outside. That's set to probably 30 to maybe 40 psi. Using compressed air to inflate glass is really nothing new, but for our team here at the museum, it is relatively new, and it's simply a byproduct of wearing a mask at work because of the pandemic. When our museum shut down, we were drawing up plans to how we would reopen and what approach we would take to continue doing what we do, and this compressed air system was one priority. So we had to play around with it. We had to figure out how much pressure we liked and what was needed. Also getting used to having the tube latched to the blowpipe. When we get up and take reheats and come back to the bench, you have to step over the tube and learn how to work with it. And it's working just fine. It did take some adapting, but we adapted rather quickly. I know some of our team prefers it for certain parts of the process, because when George is at the bench, I don't think he's going to really inflate at the moment, but when actually he will right here. So when he sits at the bench, he can turn the pipe with his left hand, he can tool it with the right, and he can inflate with his foot. So before that, you would either slide the pipe forward with both hands and blow through, or you could have your assistant come over and blow through the pipe when you'd ask them to. But with this system now, you can really work a little bit more efficiently, and for parts of the process, it is really nice. We get a lot of questions about this. Will you keep the system in place? Do you prefer it over the other method of using your mouth to blow? Again, for certain things, it's really nice, but I know we're all looking forward to the time when we don't have to use it. There is a certain amount of biorelay that we get when we blow through our mouth. You can feel how soft or stiff the glass is using that pressure. You can read that. And with this compressed air system, it doesn't care one way or another. But building up these multiple gathers, I do want to show you while George is waiting and hanging out, letting that lose temperature for his next gather, just how runny the material is in this furnace. I mentioned that it's a lot like table honey in consistency, but I'll show you. The first thing you have to do when you learn to blow glass is learn how to gather. And if you don't gather properly, what it wants to do is just drip right to the floor. So that motion of learning how to turn very smoothly with your fingers, your fingertips, takes a long time to develop. I like to use the analogy that learning to blow glass, learning how to turn the pipes and whatnot, is very similar to learning to play a musical instrument, because it just takes years of training to get that muscle memory to the point where your mind doesn't have to tell your hand what to do anymore. But once you get to that level, things become much, much smoother. And remember, George's been blowing glass for about 30 years, Jeff about 30 years as well. So not only with a larger mold, a lot more volume, will we need more glass, but George also needs an extra step when he goes up. So he's using our marbling table here to get vertical to go in the mold, but this time you'll see him jump up on this sort of mocked up step that we put together this morning. We made sure it's nice and sturdy, clamped down there with some angle iron around it, make sure it doesn't go anywhere when he jumps up there. People ask us quite a bit, how do you know the timing? How do you know when the glass is ready to gather on or when it's hot enough to blow into the mold? A lot of it comes down to experience, so you really get an internal timer developed that says when you're ready. Well, we can feel the glass softening or stiffening. As we're turning the blowpipes and the glass gets stiffer and stiffer, it gets easier to turn and keep things on center. When it's hotter and molten like this, the torque that you have to apply to keep things running smoothly is a little bit greater. So we can really feel it in our hands and our turning. This is the pipe cooler that I was talking about. So as you dip into that furnace, especially as you dip deeper into that oven, when the level of glass gets lower, pipe will heat up and you can cool it off a bit. These blocks come in all different sizes. Most of these, I believe, are cherry wood, but fruit woods really overall work great for glass making. A low resin content to them means they burn away pretty clean. They will leave residue on the glass if you use them dry. So we have to make sure that they're soaked in water. We never really let them dry out. We leave them in a bucket of tap water all the time. And this is just our local newspaper folded up. That one's probably 2 or 3 full sections, folded over many, many times, soaked in water. That tool doesn't last very long. As you might imagine, paper begins to break down, kind of crumble when it's wet like this. We get about a week's worth of use out of it. But there's a lot of similarities between vessel making with glass. If you look at a lot of the vases and the bowls and stuff like that, and ceramics or pottery. So when potters throw clay on the wheel, they pack it as nicely in the center as they can, but inevitably when that wheel starts to spin, the clay kind of jostles around a bit. So it's their job to center it nicely, and they use their hands quite a bit for that, and that's basically what the paper tool is for us. And using water to keep softening the clay so you can shape it is the heat to glass. Is it Jason that's upstairs doing the camera work for us today? Jason's up there? So Jason Thayer is up in our booth, and he's the one that's getting all these great camera shots, tracking the action. Richard just asked George how many more gathers. George said 2 more, and I think that's before we make that constriction, and then he'll probably gather 1 or more on top of that. Once he puts that constriction into the bubble, that break-off line, that's really where you start to manage how much glass you're going to gather on top of that. This is our Bring the Heat series. We've been doing this for, I believe, about a half a year, maybe even more than that now. It's kind of hard to track. I've lost track of time during this pandemic. But the Bring the Heat series is where we feature an artist. We've had a lot of demonstrations with our home team here. George just finished up a beautiful Bring the Heat collaboration with another artist named Eric Hilton, who has done an incredible amount of design work for Steuben Glass, and he has worked with George on many projects before. And you can actually look at that video, you can watch that video on YouTube. So right now we're live streaming this, but these videos will be uploaded after the fact. Usually it takes a week or two to get everything organized and get uploaded to that channel. But if you go to our YouTube channel, Corning Museum of Glass, you can look at a lot of past demonstrations. And not just Bring the Heat, but a lot of different guest artists that we have had here throughout the past years. Some amazing content on there. Again, if you've just tuned in, we're working with Richard Whiteley. He is our guest artist for this Bring the Heat. And Richard is a caster, a glass caster, but he's experimenting with our team right now, making some blown forms. Richard has created some molds out of plaster that George Kennard, who's our lead gaffer for this project, working with Jeff Mack, is blowing giant bubbles of a gray glass into these plaster molds to make these beautiful forms. This is at constriction. You see George using the jacks. Jacks are basically like taking two big butter knives and welding them together on a spring steel grip. But we squeeze the blades of the jacks down onto the bubble and form that tight, clean constriction. The tighter the line is, the easier this piece will break free when the time comes. It can be a delicate balance, though. The tighter that line gets, when George starts to reheat this giant bubble, that line can kind of soften very quickly, and it makes it hard to turn everything. But you need to have a nice tight line so the piece will break free successfully when you're done. As Jeff turns the blowpipe, George can use both hands and really squeeze those blades together. I'm just giving him a little shield on his hand when he does that. You see George wiping some beeswax on the jack blades. That's a lubrication that stops the metal from sticking. Before he takes his final gather or gathers on this setup, he's going to probably elongate this a little bit. I think he'll probably slender it down a touch. But get just the right setup before you dip in the furnace. This is a good moment to talk about that sensation, the torque that we're applying. As he stays in the oven longer and longer, he can feel the glass softening. So gravity's pull feels a little bit greater, and we have to kick up the torque in our turning to compensate and keep things running smoothly. Once again, just shielding George whenever possible. Richard's blowing the steam and smoke from the paper away from his face. He's trying to keep the gaffer as comfortable as possible.
And the normal line question is, how heavy is it?
How heavy is this? We have a question online. How much weight do you think the glass that you have there is, George?
I'd say probably 20 pounds.
George says about 20 pounds. If you take into account the blowpipe is probably also 20 pounds, maybe 25 pounds. But it's not just that, it's the fact that when he's lifting it up, he can't grab all the way towards the end either. You can see he's holding pretty close to the blowpipe because he cooled it off when he came out of our furnace, but he still can't grab all the way up. So your fulcrum point is farther back, and that makes it feel like it's a little bit heavier. But this is a significant amount of glass to be working in this manner. George works really big glass. What do you think? 1 and 2 gathers on there? 1 big gather? All right. That's true. So this furnace door, you take a look at it, that's our limitation. So you could dip in there and collect as much glass as you want, but if you have too much glass and you try to squeeze out the door, you're going to smear it all over the arch of the door or the sill. But this is a pretty common kind of shape to gather on. Sort of a nice tapered dome. So we'll make sure that we're all set with the mold here. Got the ratchet straps on there. Tighten them up. You want to tighten them right now? Okay. What you think? So we're just now tightening the straps a little bit on the mold, make sure it's secure. We're doing this right now, just not leaving it on there too long so it doesn't crumble the plaster. What you think? Think good? Okay. So the same thing, we'll release the bottom one, get it out of the way, and get the top one off. Great. Okay. Sounds good. Anybody have any questions before we take this last gather? Any more questions online? All right. Jeff's going to cool the pipe off. You can actually see where the glass is a little bit thicker, the way that George has set this bubble up. Where it's thicker, it holds the heat longer, and that orange glow is still there. But up near what will be the top section of this vessel, it's a little bit thinner, and we're starting to see that gray showing through a little bit more. Yep. All right, here we go. So I open the door all the way for him, let him plunge down in, but then I close it down, leaving him enough visual so he can see what he's doing, but really helping to shield his hands from the heat inside this furnace. Let him out. Nice gather, George. That deserves a big round of applause in itself. That is a lot of glass. Now I'm going to guess that that is probably close to 35 pounds of glass. Maybe more. George is using a metal tool called a taglia to kind of corral some of that hot glass on the tip. And a big cherry wood block. These blocks don't last forever, but this one's been around for a long, long time. You can imagine the smaller blocks get used much more frequently, but it's not nearly as often that we make big pieces like this. So those larger blocks are around for quite some time. You okay with those doors?
Yep.
All right.
We're going to hook up the hose, Jeff.
Right now?
Yeah, hook up the hose.
While you're on the
So they're hooking up the blow hose.
I don't want to wait till you're back.
Again, we do have a foot pedal that's in front of the bench here, so when George sits down, he can tap that pedal when he wants the air.
Well, at least we practiced this over and over.
Yeah, this is the first time that we've tried this larger mold. George ran through this process with Richard, I think yesterday or the day before, and Jeff, and the smaller mold, and we just had a nice successful run with that one. But this larger mold takes a good amount more glass. Same basic steps, but when you add this much more glass to anything, it definitely increases the difficulty. You can see how the glass moves back and forth when they switch directions.
Just plug that in, would you?
You're on. I gotcha. So both Jeff and George are turning the blowpipe. With this amount of material, it really helps to have multiple hands turning the pipe. That being said, George is still gaffing this piece. So he says to Jeff, back, or he'll say switch, and that's in terms of switching directions. So letting Jeff know when to turn backwards.
You guys ready to be out more close to the doors on the way out?
You going this time?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me close this one.
Go ahead, close it up.
Yep, and I'll get the, you want all the big doors?
No,
Just the middle.
you can leave them right open right now, Chris.
Okay,
It's gonna open. Seconds.
you got it. Here we go. So we don't need to press down on the top of this one, you don't think? This is pretty heavy. Just in case. All right. Yeah, getting up onto this step is definitely one of the very challenging things for George right now. But always turning the bubble, lets gravity do its thing. You can see how the bubble really thins out in that process. And then he plunges down in. Inflating. That's a big mold.
Up there. Yep. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Good.
Ready?
Let it down. Don't let it up yet.
Yep. You just say when. Ready? That one's done. And that one's loose. And off. You okay, George?
I got it. Watch out.
He's gonna swing around. So we're all doing some work here. Richard's cleaning the residue off the bubble. Jeff was turning, George was torching.
Flash. Doors.
Carl's jumped in to give us a hand.
Shield.
Same kind of thing. We need to balance the temperatures out.
I got the doors, Carl. Will you get
So
that?
George will take quick reheats. Might use that torch a couple more times. You okay? And Jeff's gonna suit up and get ready to catch this. Boy, that was a beautiful job, George.
Doors at the thin spot. Yeah.
It's, the bottom is pretty rounded, but it's not really moving in. I got you. So it's really important that we keep these thinner areas warm enough so nothing cracks or breaks. And that's why George is using a propane torch on those.
Let's set it up to break it off over there.
George just said, let's set it up to break it off on the other side of our stage, which is a smart move, so Jeff doesn't have to.
That's what I need.
Let's see where that paddle went.
Enough doors?
Can you pick this up, Jeff? Have it more towards the bottom, okay? It's a little thicker.
Oh, yeah. Gotcha. You have to cradle it, George.
Yeah. We'll do it over there, okay?
You know, you over there?
Yeah, so that way you just turn around. Open.
Tweezers and a big paddle, yep. All right. Gotcha, yep. Water on that jack line. Creating a lot of stress cracks. You want the top or the bottom annealer? Okay. Gotcha. Away it goes into the top annealer. How about a huge round of applause for the team? What an effort. That's Richard Whiteley, George Kenner, Jeff Mack. That was exciting, yeah? Fantastic. That is a big mold to blow into and a beautiful job. Would you care to say any closing remarks about that? How do you think it went?
That's incredible. I didn't think we'd get it the first time. That's a very ambitious mold. It's a kind of a bit of a crazy scale. But to work with such a talented team and to be able to experiment with these ideas has been such a treat. So big thanks to the whole team here for helping out. This collaboration is really unique. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, our pleasure. Let's give it up one more time for Richard Whiteley. Beautiful, beautiful pieces. Can't wait to see the end result. Again, if you want to tune back in and watch that whole demonstration, if anybody only caught part of it, or if you do want to see the finished pieces, I believe that those will be posted at the end of that video on YouTube when it is uploaded. So do check back with that. But thank you everybody very much for joining us. That is going to end this demonstration. Our next show in here will begin at 12:30. So there is a lot more glass.